She stood at my cabin door with a citation in one hand and a lawyer's number in the other, her face twisted with righteous fury. "This structure is illegal," she hissed, her HOA president badge glinting in the mountain sunlight. "You have 72 hours to remove it, or I'm bringing the sheriff." I let her finish her practice speech, then pulled out a single document from my grandfather's desk, a land deed stamped 1889. Her face went white as she read the property boundaries. Everything she'd built her empire on, every fine she'd collected, every rule she'd enforced, all of it sat on my land. The first time Marcus Chen saw Catherine Whitmore, she was measuring his herb garden with a tape measure, her lips moving silently as she calculated what he assumed were violations. He'd been living in his grandfather's cabin for exactly 3 weeks, and this was his introduction to the Shadow Creek HOA president. "Excuse me," Marcus called from the porch, setting down his coffee. "Can I help you?" Catherine didn't look up immediately. She finished her measurements, recorded something on her tablet, then approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to compliance. She was in her mid-50s, dressed in an immaculate pantsuit despite the mountain setting, her silver hair styled in a severe bob. "Marcus Chen?" She didn't wait for confirmation. "I'm Catherine Whitmore, president of the Shadow Creek Homeowners Association. Your property is in violation of 17 different HOA regulations." She thrust her tablet toward him, screen filled with photographs and measurements. "The exterior paint color is not from the approved palette. Your herb garden extends 6 inches beyond the permitted boundary. That fire pit is 3 feet too close to the property line. And this cabin structure itself lacks proper architectural approval." Marcus took the tablet, scrolling through the meticulous documentation. "I wasn't aware I was part of an HOA." "Ignorance isn't an excuse." Catherine's smile was thin and sharp. "Every property in Shadow Creek Valley falls under our jurisdiction. We've maintained this community's standards for 22 years. Your grandfather, may he rest in peace, was always compliant." "My grandfather built this cabin himself in 1958. Which is why it requires retroactive approval and significant modifications to meet current standards." She retrieved her tablet. "You have 30 days to submit plans for corrections. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $500, increasing by 10% each week." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He'd inherited this property after his grandfather's death 3 months ago, a sanctuary away from his high-stress tech career in Seattle. The cabin was his refuge, the last connection to a man who taught him about resilience and independence. "I'll need to review the HOA documents," Marcus said carefully. "My grandfather never mentioned being part of one." "They're on file at the county recorder's office, though I've taken the liberty of emailing you a copy." Catherine pulled out a business card. "My contact information. I suggest you hire an architect familiar with our requirements. The 30-day clock starts today." She walked back to her white Mercedes SUV, parked deliberately to block his driveway. As she drove away, Marcus noticed the Shadow Creek HOA sticker on her rear window, a stylized mountain peak with the words, "Preserving Excellence since 2002. The number stuck in his mind. Inside the cabin, Marcus opened his laptop and found Catherine's email waiting. The HOA document was extensive, 83 pages of regulations covering everything from roof pitch angles to acceptable bird feeder designs. He skimmed through, noting the formation date, May 15, 2002. Marcus walked to his grandfather's study, a small room lined with filing cabinets and leather-bound books. The old man had been meticulous about records, keeping everything from property tax receipts to handwritten journals. Marcus had been slowly working through the files, learning about his grandfather's life through decades of careful documentation. He found the property documents in the 3rd drawer. The deed was a beautiful piece of history, thick paper with ornate calligraphy and an embossed seal. Marcus spread it across the oak desk and began reading. The legal description was complex, full of metes and bounds that meant little to him initially. But as he traced the boundaries with his finger, following the landmarks mentioned, from the lightning-struck pine to the granite outcropping, thence to the creek fork, he began to understand the scope. His phone rang, unknown number. "Mr. Chen, this is Donald Price, Catherine Whitmore's attorney." The voice was professionally cordial. "Mrs. Whitmore has asked me to emphasize the seriousness of the HOA violations. If you'd like to discuss a payment plan for the anticipated fines, I'm happy to arrange that." "I haven't agreed to any fines," Marcus said. Refusal to comply with HOA regulations constitutes acceptance of financial penalties as outlined in the governing documents. This is legally binding. I'd hate to see this escalate to liens or foreclosure proceedings. Marcus ended the call. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from anger at the casual threat to take away his inheritance. He returned to the deed, this time pulling out his laptop and opening a mapping application. Carefully, he began plotting the boundary points mentioned in the 1889 document. The lightning-struck pine was gone, but his grandfather's journals mentioned it. He'd marked its location on a hand-drawn map dated 1963. As Marcus worked through the evening, translating 19th-century landmarks into GPS coordinates, a picture began to emerge. His property wasn't just the 2 acres around the cabin. The original land grant from his great-great-grandfather, Chen Wei, who'd worked on the railroad and purchased this land with his savings, encompassed significantly more territory. By midnight, Marcus had mapped the entire boundary. He sat back, staring at the screen, his heart pounding. The Shadow Creek community, all 47 homes, the clubhouse, the tennis courts, the entrance gate with its stone pillars and Shadow Creek sign sat entirely within the boundaries of his property. Every single structure Catherine Whitmore had spent 22 years regulating, every fine she'd collected, every architectural modification she'd demanded, all of it had been built on land that belonged to him. Marcus pulled up the HOA formation documents again, reading more carefully. In 2002, a developer named Prescott Holdings had purchased development rights from what they listed as unoccupied territorial parcels. They'd created the HOA, sold lots, built luxury homes. But they'd never actually owned the land. They'd relied on the fact that Marcus's grandfather, living quietly in his cabin, hadn't challenged their claims. Perhaps they'd assumed the old Chinese man wouldn't understand legal processes or wouldn't have the resources to fight. Or perhaps they'd simply gambled that no one would ever check the original land grants carefully enough. Marcus opened his grandfather's last journal, dated just weeks before his death. On the final page, in shaking handwriting, was a note. "Marcus, the land remembers, the paper never forgets, be strong like the mountain." Dawn was breaking over the valley when Marcus finally went to bed. Catherine Whitmore's 30-day deadline meant nothing now. He had something much more powerful than architectural plans. He had proof that she'd been living on his land for 22 years, and that every fine she'd ever collected was based on authority she'd never actually possessed. Marcus spent the next week quietly gathering evidence. He contacted the county recorder's office, obtained certified copies of every land transaction in Shadow Creek Valley since 1889, and hired a surveyor who specialized in historical property boundaries. He also retained Margaret Torres, a property attorney in her 60s with a reputation for taking on impossible cases. "This is remarkable," Margaret said during their first meeting, spreading the documents across her conference table. "The original land grant is absolutely clear. Your great-great-grandfather purchased 847 acres from the federal government in 1889. The deed was properly recorded, taxes have been paid continuously, and there's never been a legal transfer of ownership." "How did Prescott Holdings get away with developing it?" Marcus asked. "They didn't buy the land, they couldn't have because it wasn't for sale. They filed for development rights based on what they claimed were abandoned parcels." Margaret tapped a document. "They cited a county ordinance about properties that appear unused or neglected, but that ordinance requires extensive notification attempts and a judicial process, none of which happened here. So everything built after 2002 is technically trespassing. Not just trespassing, every structure is on your land without permission. The HOA has no legal standing because the entity that created it had no authority to do so." Margaret looked at him seriously. "Marcus, do you understand what this means? You could demand removal of every building. You could sue for decades of unpaid rent. You could essentially erase Shadow Creek from existence." Marcus thought about the families he'd seen in the valley. Children riding bikes, elderly couples walking dogs, people who'd bought homes in good faith, believing everything was legitimate. "I don't want to hurt innocent homeowners," he said. "But Catherine Whitmore threatened to take my grandfather's cabin. She's been collecting fines and fees for 22 years based on authority she never had." "Then we need to be strategic," Margaret said. "Let's see how she responds to the truth." On day 23 of Catherine's 30-day deadline, Marcus received a formal notice of violation. The letter informed him that he'd failed to submit correction plans and that fines would begin accruing at $500 per day starting in 7 days. The letter was copied to Catherine's attorney, the HOA board, and the county code enforcement office. Marcus responded with a single-page letter, delivered by certified mail to Catherine Whitmore personally. The letter contained 3 sentences. I am in receipt of your violation notice dated November 4, 2025. Please be advised that all structures within Shadow Creek Development are located on property legally owned by the Chen family since 1889. Enclosed is a certified copy of the recorded deed for your review. Catherine called within an hour. This is some kind of joke, she said, her voice tight with anger. That deed is obviously fraudulent. I'm reporting you for attempted fraud and harassment. The deed is recorded with the county, Marcus replied calmly. You're welcome to verify it yourself. It's public record. My attorney will demolish whatever scam you're trying to pull. You have 7 days to comply with HOA regulations, or I'm proceeding with fines and legal action. She hung up. Marcus waited. 3 days later, his surveyor completed the boundary markers. The man had meticulously located every corner of the original property, installing official survey stakes with bright orange flags. The stakes ran through the Shadow Creek entrance, around the clubhouse, across the tennis courts, and through at least a dozen carefully landscaped yards. Catherine organized an emergency HOA meeting that evening. Marcus attended, sitting quietly in the back of the clubhouse as 47 homeowners filled the room. We have a situation, Catherine began, standing at the podium with rigid posture. A new resident is making false claims about property ownership in an attempt to avoid legitimate HOA regulations. His surveyor has vandalized common areas with unauthorized markers. I'm asking for the board's approval to pursue immediate legal action and to accelerate the fine schedule. A hand went up. Robert Hashimoto, a retired engineer Marcus had briefly met at the grocery store. Catherine, I checked the deed he referenced. It's legitimate. It's been on file since 1889. That deed refers to some historical parcel that no longer exists, Catherine snapped. Property boundaries change. Development updates records. This is settled law. Actually, it's not. Margaret Torres stood from where she'd been sitting beside Marcus. May I address the board? Catherine's face flushed. This is a closed meeting for residents only. Mr. Chen's attorney, and I'm here to provide information relevant to every person in this room. Margaret walked to the front, projecting calm authority. The deed Mr. Chen holds is not only legitimate, it's the foundational document for this entire valley. Prescott Holdings never owned this land. They filed for development rights based on abandoned property claims, but those claims were legally invalid. Every structure in Shadow Creek was built without the permission of the actual landowner. The room erupted. Voices overlapped, angry, frightened, confused. That's absurd, Catherine shouted over the noise. We all have deeds. We bought our properties legally. You have deeds that trace back to Prescott Holdings, Margaret continued. But Prescott Holdings had no legal right to sell land they didn't own. It's a fundamental principle of property law. You can't transfer title you don't possess. A woman in the front row stood, her voice shaking. Are you saying our homes aren't legally ours? Your improvements, the structures you built, those are yours, Margaret said. But the land underneath belongs to Mr. Chen. This is a complex situation that will require careful resolution. Marcus watched Catherine's face transform through several emotions: disbelief, rage, calculation, and finally, something that looked like fear. She gripped the podium. This is extortion, Catherine said. He's trying to terrorize this community into dropping legitimate enforcement actions. I just want to live peacefully in my grandfather's cabin, Marcus said, standing. All eyes turned to him. I didn't ask for any of this. You came to my property with threats and fines. You told me I had to change my grandfather's cabin or lose it. All I did was check the actual legal ownership. You're trying to steal our homes, someone shouted. No, Marcus said firmly. I'm trying to protect mine. Mrs. Whitmore has spent 22 years enforcing rules and collecting fees based on authority she never had. Maybe instead of attacking me, you should ask her where all that money went. The room went silent. Catherine's face drained of color. The HOA funds are properly managed and audited, she said, but her voice had lost its conviction. Robert Hashimoto spoke again. Catherine, when was our last financial audit? I don't recall seeing a report since 2019. The documents are available to any resident who requests them through proper channels. I'm requesting them now, Robert said. As are my neighbors, I suspect. Heads nodded throughout the room. The energy had shifted. People were no longer looking at Marcus as the threat. Catherine gathered her papers with shaking hands. This meeting is adjourned. I'll be consulting with our attorneys about criminal charges against Mr. Chen for fraud and intimidation. She walked out, heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. As the room emptied, several residents approached Marcus. Some were angry, demanding to know what he wanted. Others were simply frightened about their homes. He gave them all the same answer. I want to find a fair solution. Talk to your own attorneys. Understand your actual legal position. Then we'll figure this out together. The last to approach was Robert Hashimoto. My father came here from Japan in 1952, he said quietly. Worked 3 jobs to buy our first home. I understand what your grandfather faced, what it meant for a Chinese immigrant to own land in this country back then. That deed represents something more than property lines. It was all he had to give me, Marcus said. I won't let someone take it away because they think they have more power. Good, Robert said, because I did some research tonight. The HOA has collected approximately $2.3 million in fees and fines over 22 years. If Catherine can't account for every dollar, you won't be the only one asking questions. Marcus drove home as storm clouds gathered over the mountains. Inside the cabin, he stood by the window where his grandfather used to watch the valley, wondering what the old man would think of all this. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. You've made a serious mistake, this isn't over. Marcus saved the message. He had a feeling he'd be showing it to the authorities soon. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, covering the valley in white, covering Catherine Whitmore's empire in a blanket that made everything look clean and pristine, even though Marcus now knew exactly how much rot lay underneath. The next morning, Marcus woke to find 3 cars parked at the end of his driveway. 2 were county vehicles. The third was Catherine Whitmore's Mercedes. He watched from the window as she gestured animatedly to 2 men in official jackets, pointing toward his cabin. Marcus called Margaret Tours before going outside. Don't say anything without me present, she instructed. I'll be there in 40 minutes. If they have a warrant, comply. If they don't, you're under no obligation to let them on your property. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Defending his property rights from county officials who'd never questioned the development that had actually violated those rights for 2 decades. He stepped onto the porch as the group approached. Catherine hung back, letting the officials take the lead. Mr. Chen, I'm Inspector Davies from County Code Enforcement, and this is Inspector Lin from Building and Safety. We've received complaints about unpermitted modifications and potential safety violations. What modifications? Marcus asked. Mrs. Whitmore has reported that you've made structural changes without permits, installed unauthorized utility connections, and created fire hazards with improper heating sources. Marcus felt his temper rise but kept his voice level. This cabin was built in 1958. Nothing has been modified, and I have documentation for every system in this building. We still need to conduct an inspection, Davies said, not unkindly. Standard procedure when complaints are filed. Do you have a warrant? We don't need one for code enforcement inspections. Actually, you do need one to enter my home without permission. Margaret Torr's voice came from behind them. She'd made it in 25 minutes, apparently. And I'd be fascinated to hear the legal basis for these complaints, given that Mrs. Whitmore has no standing to file them. Catherine stepped forward. I'm the HOA president. It's my responsibility to report violations. You're the president of an organization with no legal authority over this property, Margaret replied. Mr. Chen is not a member of your HOA, has never agreed to your covenants, and owes you no compliance whatsoever. Furthermore, any complaints you file at this point could be construed as harassment and retaliation. Inspector Lin looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, we're just responding to filed complaints. We don't get involved in property disputes. Then you should verify the complainant's standing before showing up on private property. Margaret turned to Marcus. Do you consent to an inspection? Marcus considered. He had nothing to hide, and cooperation might demonstrate good faith. Yes, but I want documentation of every finding and every complaint Mrs. Whitmore filed. The inspection took 90 minutes. Both inspectors were thorough and professional, checking electrical panels, plumbing connections, structural supports, and fire safety equipment. Marcus provided his grandfather's meticulous maintenance records for every system. When they finished, Inspector Davies looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Chen, everything here is up to code. Better than code, actually. I wish more properties were maintained this well." "So the complaints were false?" Margaret asked. "The complaints were, let's say, overstated," Davies replied diplomatically. He glanced at Catherine. "Mrs. Whitmore, filing false reports is a serious matter. We have limited resources, and this visit was unnecessary." Catherine's jaw tightened. "I reported what appeared to be violations based on my understanding of county codes." "Your understanding is incorrect," Lynn said flatly, "and we'll be noting that in our report." After they left, Catherine remained standing in Marcus's driveway, her composure cracking. "You think you're clever," she said. "You think some old piece of paper changes everything. But I've built this community, 22 years of my life. I've maintained property values, enforced standards, kept Shadow Creek the premier address in this county." "On land you don't own," Marcus said, "collecting fees you have no right to collect. Everyone here bought their properties legally. They have rights. Rights that end where mine begin." Marcus descended from the porch, closing the distance between them. "You came to my home with threats. You tried to use government agencies to harass me. You've sent threatening text messages, all because I wouldn't let you bully me into changing my grandfather's cabin. I was enforcing community standards." "You were enforcing control," Marcus interrupted, "and now you're realizing you never actually had any." Catherine's composure shattered entirely. "You want money, is that it? How much to make this go away? To sign over some acknowledgement of the HOA's authority?" "I don't want your money." "Then what? What do you want?" Marcus thought about his grandfather, living quietly in this cabin for decades while a whole community grew around him. Never causing trouble, always paying his taxes, watching as people who thought they owned the valley built their mansions and their rules. "I want what my grandfather wanted," Marcus said. "To be left alone, to live in peace on land his father bought with money earned laying railroad tracks. Land no one can take away because some HOA president thinks it doesn't fit her aesthetic standards." Catherine's eyes glittered with tears, whether from rage or fear Marcus couldn't tell. "This isn't over. I have attorneys, resources. You have no idea what you're up against." "Actually," Margaret interjected, "he has a very clear idea, and so do you, which is why you're scrambling. Mrs. Whitmore, I'd strongly suggest you retain separate counsel from the HOA's attorney. Your interests and theirs are about to diverge significantly." After Catherine left, Margaret and Marcus sat on the porch. "She's going to fight," Margaret said. "She'll claim adverse possession, argue that 22 years of open and notorious use of the property transfers rights, challenge the validity of the original deed, probably file counterclaims about your grandfather's supposed acknowledgement of the HOA. Will any of it work? No, adverse possession requires the possession to be hostile against the owner's interests. Your grandfather paid property taxes continuously, maintained his residence, never abandoned his rights. And you inherited those rights cleanly." Margaret paused. "But she can make it expensive and time-consuming. The question is whether you're prepared for a long fight." Marcus looked out at the valley. Snow still covered the ground from last night, pristine and beautiful. Smoke rose from chimneys in the homes below. He could see children building a snowman near the clubhouse. "Those families didn't do anything wrong," he said. "They bought homes in good faith. I don't want to destroy their lives." "You may not have a choice about disrupting them," Margaret said. "But you can choose how. We could negotiate a settlement, acknowledge their structures in exchange for back payments for land use, formalize proper easements, dissolve the HOA, and create a legitimate homeowner's agreement with you as the actual landowner." "What about Catherine?" "She's the problem we need to solve first, because she won't accept any solution that doesn't preserve her power." Margaret stood. "I'm going to file a formal demand for the HOA's financial records, all 22 years. If there's fraud or embezzlement, it'll give us leverage, and it'll show the other residents that their real enemy isn't you." That evening, Marcus received an email from Robert Hashimoto. The subject line read, "You need to see this." The email contained a series of financial documents, incomplete HOA budgets from various years, showing fees collected but vague line items for expenses, administrative costs that increased annually, community improvement funds with no detailed accounting, legal reserves that somehow required $30,000 per year. Robert's message was brief. Catherine refused to provide full records at tonight's emergency board meeting, said they were proprietary. 3 board members resigned in protest. We're calling for a forensic audit, but she's blocking access to the accounts. Thought you should know, this is bigger than your property dispute. Marcus forwarded the email to Margaret, then sat at his grandfather's desk. The old man's journal was still there, open to that final page. The paper never forgets. His grandfather had known, had understood that someday someone would need proof of what the Chen family had built, what they'd earned, what couldn't be taken away by people who thought rules and regulations trumped ownership and history. Marcus's phone rang, unknown number again. Mr. Chen, this is Donald Price, Catherine's attorney. I'm calling to discuss a settlement. Mrs. Whitmore is prepared to offer $250,000 for a quitclaim deed acknowledging HOA authority over the cabin property, plus an agreement not to pursue claims against Shadow Creek Development. No. Mr. Chen, be reasonable. This is a generous offer given the dubious nature of your claims. My claims aren't dubious. They're documented, recorded, and legally unassailable. Your client built an empire on stolen land, and now she's trying to buy her way out. $500,000, Price said quickly. Final offer, take it or face years of litigation. I'll see you in court, Marcus said and hung up. He walked outside into the cold night air. The valley stretched below, lights twinkling from homes built on his family's land. His grandfather had watched this same view for decades, watching the valley change, staying quiet. But Marcus wasn't his grandfather. He'd been silent long enough. He pulled out his phone and composed an email to every Shadow Creek resident whose address he could find through public records. The subject line was simple: the truth about your property. In the email, he attached the deed, the survey results, and a simple explanation of the situation. He also attached Robert's financial documents showing Catherine's refusal to provide full HOA accounting. I'm not your enemy, he wrote, but we all deserve to know the truth about who owns what and who's been collecting money in the name of protecting your interests. Let's find a solution together, one that doesn't involve Catherine Whitmore deciding what happens on land she's never owned. He hit send just as the first police car pulled into his driveway, lights flashing in the darkness. Catherine had apparently decided to escalate. 2 officers emerged from the patrol car, their expressions neutral but alert. Marcus remained on the porch, his phone still in his hand, as Margaret had instructed him to document any official interactions. Marcus Chen? The lead officer asked. He was in his 40s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent years on mountain patrol. That's me. I'm Officer Reeves. We received a report of harassment and stalking. Catherine Whitmore claims you've been sending threatening communications to residents of Shadow Creek, trespassing on HOA property, and making verbal threats against her personally. Marcus felt his pulse quicken but kept his voice steady. That's completely false. I sent one email to residents tonight explaining the legal situation with the property. Before that, Mrs. Whitmore has been the one threatening me. I have documentation of everything. The second officer, younger and clearly less comfortable with the situation, spoke up. Sir, Mrs. Whitmore says you've been surveying private properties without permission and intimidating residents at HOA meetings. The surveying was done on my property, Marcus replied, and I attended one public HOA meeting where I sat quietly until asked to speak. Officer Reeves, I think you should know that Mrs. Whitmore has been filing false code enforcement complaints, sending threatening text messages, and trying to use official channels to harass me because I won't comply with an HOA that has no legal authority over my property. Reeves's expression shifted slightly. You're the one with the old land deed. I heard about this at the station. Then you know I'm not the aggressor here. The younger officer glanced at his partner uncertainly. Reeves pulled out his notepad. Let's start from the beginning. Walk me through the whole situation. Marcus did, providing a clear timeline. Catherine's initial visit with violation notices, the threats of fines and legal action, his discovery of the deed, the surveying, the HOA meeting, the false code enforcement complaints, and tonight's email. He showed them copies of every document, including the threatening text message Catherine had sent. Reeves studied the messages. Mrs. Whitmore claims you threatened to destroy everything she's built. I told her she'd been enforcing rules based on authority she didn't possess. That's not a threat, it's a fact. Marcus pulled up his email on his phone. Here's what I sent tonight. You tell me if there's anything threatening in it. Both officers read the email. The younger one whistled softly. If this deed is legitimate, this is a hell of a property dispute. It's legitimate, Marcus said. Recorded in 1889, taxes paid continuously, chain of title unbroken. My attorney has verified everything. Reeves handed back the phone. Mr. Chen, I'm not going to cite you for anything tonight, but I'd advise you to let your attorney handle communications from here on out. Property disputes can get ugly, and even justified actions can be misconstrued. What about Catherine Whitmore filing false reports? That's between her and code enforcement, Reeves said carefully. But for what it's worth, I'd document everything. Date, time, witnesses. If she's making false claims to law enforcement, that's something the DA might be interested in. After the officers left, Marcus called Margaret despite the late hour. She's panicking, Margaret said immediately. Good, panic people make mistakes, but she's also dangerous when cornered. I'm filing for a restraining order tomorrow. Her pattern of harassment is well documented now. Will it work? It'll send a message, and it'll create an official record that she's been the aggressor. Margaret paused. Marcus, your email tonight was bold, also risky. You've just turned all 47 homeowners into active participants in this fight. They deserve to know the truth. They do, but now they're scared, and scared people don't always behave rationally. Some will blame you for threatening their security. Others will blame Catherine for lying to them. It's going to get messy before it gets better. Marcus barely slept that night. His inbox exploded with responses to the email, angry demands for more information, panicked questions about property values, a few expressions of support, and several hostile messages accusing him of trying to steal their homes. But the most interesting response came at 2 a.m. from an email address he didn't recognize. Mr. Chen, I'm a former HOA board member who resigned in 2019 after discovering irregularities in the financial records. Catherine threatened to sue me for defamation if I spoke publicly. Now that this is all coming out anyway, I think we should talk. There's a lot you don't know about Shadow Creek's finances. Patricia Morrison. Marcus responded immediately, suggesting they meet the next morning. Patricia Morrison turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her late 60s, a retired accountant who arrived at Marcus's cabin with 3 boxes of documents. I saved everything before I resigned, she said, spreading files across his kitchen table. Catherine said I was paranoid, called me senile, but I knew something was wrong. The documents painted a damning picture. Over 14 years of HOA management, Catherine had consistently inflated expenses, created phantom vendors for services never rendered, and funneled money into accounts controlled solely by her. The Community Improvement Fund had paid for renovations to her personal home. The legal reserve had covered her daughter's college tuition. The administrative costs included luxury vacations categorized as board retreats. I estimate she's embezzled at least $800,000, Patricia said. Maybe more. When I confronted her, she said I was misunderstanding the accounting. When I pushed harder, she threatened to ruin me, said she'd tell everyone I was stealing, that I was mentally incompetent, that she'd make sure I lost everything. Why didn't you go to the police? Because I was scared, Patricia admitted. Catherine knows everyone. The county commissioner is her college roommate. The sheriff's wife is in her book club. She's built a network of influence over 2 decades, and I was just a retired accountant trying to do the right thing. She looked at Marcus with tears in her eyes. But you're not scared of her, and you have something she can't fight, proof that everything she built is a lie. Margaret arrived an hour later and spent the afternoon photographing every document. By evening, they had enough evidence to file a formal complaint with the district attorney's office for fraud, embezzlement, and theft. This changes everything, Margaret said. Catherine wasn't just running an unauthorized HOA, she was running a criminal enterprise. The homeowners aren't just dealing with property disputes, they're victims of a long-term fraud scheme. That evening, Marcus sent a second email to Shadow Creek residents. This one included a summary of Patricia's findings and an invitation. Anyone who'd paid HOA fees over the past 22 years had potentially been defrauded and should consider joining a class action lawsuit against Catherine Whitmore personally. The response was immediate and explosive. Marcus's phone rang constantly. Residents who'd paid thousands in fees and fines over the years, people who'd been threatened or intimidated, board members who'd been forced out when they asked questions. The dam had broken. By midnight, 41 of the 47 households had signed onto the class action. Catherine's attorney called at 1 a.m. My client is willing to settle for mutual releases. She'll resign from the HOA, relinquish all claims to authority over your property, and pay $50,000 in damages if you drop all legal actions and agree not to pursue the financial allegations. Tell your client that the financial allegations are now with the district attorney, Marcus said. And my property was never hers to relinquish claims to. She has nothing I want except accountability. You're making a mistake. No, she made the mistake 22 years ago when she built an empire on stolen land and stole from everyone who trusted her. I'm just making sure she faces the consequences. Marcus hung up and sat in his grandfather's study, exhausted but unable to sleep. The cabin was quiet except for the wind in the pines outside, the same wind his grandfather had listened to for decades. A soft knock at the door made him jump. Through the window, he saw Robert Hashimoto standing on the porch, snow dusting his shoulders. Robert, it's 1:30 in the morning. I know, I'm sorry, but you need to know, Catherine just cleaned out the HOA bank accounts. All of them, over $200,000 she's running. Marcus grabbed his phone and called Margaret, who answered immediately despite the hour. We need to freeze her assets now, Margaret said. I'll call the DA's emergency line. If she's fleeing, we can get a warrant. There's more, Robert said, looking grim. Before she emptied the accounts, she sent an email to everyone claiming you're trying to steal their homes, that you've fabricated evidence, and that you're working with outside agitators to destroy Shadow Creek. She's telling people to prepare for legal action against you. Marcus felt the situation spiraling. What had started as defending his grandfather's cabin had become a complex web of property rights, embezzlement, community conflict, and now apparent flight from justice. Is she still at her house? Marcus asked. Her car's in the driveway, lights are on. Margaret's voice came through the phone speaker. Don't go near her property. Let law enforcement handle this. I'm calling the DA right now. But Marcus was already grabbing his jacket. Robert, come with me. We're not confronting her. We're just making sure she doesn't leave before the police arrive. They drove through the quiet valley to Catherine's home, a sprawling modern mansion on the hillside, the nicest property in Shadow Creek, Marcus noted, built on his land, paid for with stolen money. Her Mercedes was indeed in the driveway, but as they watched from the street, the garage door opened and a second vehicle emerged, a black Range Rover. Catherine was behind the wheel, her face illuminated by the dashboard lights. She saw them immediately. For a moment their eyes met through the car windows. Her expression was a mixture of rage and desperation. Then she gunned the engine, backing out rapidly. She's running, Robert said. Marcus didn't hesitate. He pulled his truck across the street, blocking her exit. Catherine laid on the horn, screaming something he couldn't hear. Then she threw the Range Rover in drive and accelerated toward the curb, clearly intending to go around him on the lawn. Lights flooded the street, 3 police cruisers approaching fast from different directions. Catherine slammed on her brakes, trapped between Marcus's truck and the arriving officers. Officer Reeves emerged from the lead car, and his expression said he was done being diplomatic. Catherine Whitmore, turn off your vehicle and step out with your hands visible. Through her windshield, Marcus watched Catherine's face crumble. The mask of control and authority she'd worn for 2 decades finally shattered completely. As officers surrounded her vehicle, Marcus thought about his grandfather's final journal entry. The land remembers, the paper never forgets. And neither, apparently, did justice.